Welcome to the CHCH Newsmakers podcast. I'm your host, Rick Zamperin. If it is making news in Hamilton, Halton, and Niagara, across Canada or around the world, we're going to tackle it on Newsmakers. Last weekend, the United States captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and plans to run the South American country, including its oil industry. Now, what impact is that going to have on Canada's oil and energy sector? Joseph Steinberg is a professor of economics at the University of Toronto and joins me on Newsmakers. Professor, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Well, let's start with the biggest, maybe most important question. How will the events of last weekend in Venezuela impact Canada's oil and energy industry?
So I think the short answer is, at least in the short term, not very much. I know that people are worried about it, particularly because the type of oil that Venezuela produces is perhaps more similar to what Canada produces than any other country. But the reality is that in the short run, there's just not that much scope for Venezuelan oil to displace Canadian oil.
I guess maybe one of the more unique questions, and this comes in advance of Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's visit with Xi Jinping, the president of China, coming up very soon, is that China has relied on Venezuela oil for years. Venezuela is the biggest oil exporter to China. That's, I believe, 68% of its product. Is China now looking to Canada to say, we're not confident that we're going to get the oil from Venezuela because the U.S. is now operating their market? We might look now to Canada.
I don't think we can say for sure, but I have to imagine that that's one of the things that's going to be discussed during the Prime Minister's visit. Already about an eighth of what Canada produces ends up in Asia, particularly China. And so certainly there's potential to expand that. And I think you're absolutely right that if the oil that has historically gone from Venezuela to China no longer does so, China is going to need to get it from somewhere else. And as I mentioned before, the similarity between the characteristics of the oil that China and Venezuela produce would make it relatively easy for China to rely more on China's refineries to rely more on Canadian oil.
So what changes or what impact would that have on the Canadian market from an economic standpoint?
So again, I think we should be realistic about what to expect in the short run. And so one of the things that I think is important to mention is that, the oil that Venezuela produces is going to end up, to the extent that it does end up in the United States, it's going to end up in refineries on the Gulf Coast. And so there is a small fraction of Canadian oil that ultimately ends up being refined in the Gulf Coast. But the vast majority of what we sell to the United States ends up being refined in the Midwest. And there are pipelines that run down from the Midwest down to the Gulf Coast, but they're not configured to go the other way. And so it would be very difficult, at least in the short run, and I really think in the medium run as well, for several years to come, for Venezuelan oil to flow up to the Gulf and then through pipelines up to the Midwest refineries. And so I think it's really unlikely that we're going to see Venezuelan oil displace Canadian oil in those Midwest refineries anytime soon. And so that really limits the extent to which Canada is going to feel much of a hit from this. Really, I think really the only way in which we're going to feel this is, small to moderate movements in the world price of oil. Those affect us, and there's some scope for Venezuelan supply to push that world price downward a little bit. The value of what we sell to the U.S. might fall a little bit, but that's about all I think we should expect.
Could this ultimately have an impact on gas prices at some point down the road?
It certainly could. Again, if more Venezuelan supply eventually comes online, that could, push world oil prices downwards, and that has, there's some ability for that to push prices at the pump downwards as well. But again, we do have to be cautious about where this crude oil is flowing, where it's going to get refined. There's not that much scope for this Venezuelan oil to end up in the refineries that matter for, Canadian drivers. And so there's going to be, you shouldn't expect maybe one-for-one movements in the world price of oil and the price at the pump for Canadians induced by increased Venezuelan supply.
One of the more interesting comments that U.S. President Donald Trump made post arrest or capture, if you will, of Venezuela's president is that the United States is going to run Venezuela and is going to, entice or encourage U.S. Oil companies to extract the oil in Venezuela, sell it at market value. It'll benefit Venezuelans, according to President Trump. He's also said that they're going to reimburse the U.S. companies that do so. Do you think there's an appetite from U.S. Oil and gas producers to do that?
To be quite frank, I think the answer is no. The reality is, I know that President Trump says that the United States is going to run Venezuela, quote unquote. But, President Trump's term, we're already a quarter of the way through it. There's no chance that any investments in improving Venezuelan oil extraction infrastructure are going to generate returns during that 3-year time frame. And so all of these oil majors in the United States are thinking about what the situation is going to look like after the end of President Trump's term. And so that looks extraordinarily uncertain. I also think you have to look at the way that the current plan seems to be shaping up, which is, the Maduro regime is still in power. The Vice President, Delcy Rodriguez, she's in charge. The regime's enforcer, Diosdado Cabello, he's still, in charge on the ground. This is certainly not what Venezuelans and the Venezuelan diaspora more broadly want. The immediate reaction amongst many in the Venezuelan community to what was going on last week was, everyone was really happy about this. This is what everybody is finally looking for. Democracy is coming to Venezuela. Doesn't look like that's what's happening in the short term. And so the pressure within Venezuela for actual reform is not going to go away as long as the Maduro regime and, many of its figureheads are still in charge on the ground. And so as long as that pressure is still there, the uncertainty about what the situation in Venezuela is going to look like in the medium to the long run is not going to go away. If anything, I think the uncertainty in the medium run is going to rise. There's going to be great potential for additional civil unrest in Venezuela as long as the regime remains in power. But without Maduro, I think the regime's grasp on power is likely to be, perhaps less tenable. I can't see a world in which American companies are going to devote huge, tens to even hundreds of billions of dollars worth of investment to Venezuela until things become clearer.
I was going to actually ask you about that cost. We're talking tens and hundreds of millions of dollars and years to get this infrastructure back up to snuff.
Exactly. Yeah, the years is precisely the problem, right? The president can say all he wants about the U.S. running Venezuela, but the reality is, that can only last as long as the president himself is in charge of things. What's going to happen as soon as President Trump is no longer in power? I don't think anybody has any idea what that portends for Venezuela.
Back in Canada, there remains this gap or this untapped potential because we still have a great need to get our resources to market. I know we've built some pipelines. There is a lot of discussion that more is needed, and there's, of course, some pushback. Where do we go from here in terms of getting that product to market?
Well, I think that's a great question. And I think, if there is kind of a silver lining for Canada in all of this, I think it is that the situation, even if it might not quantitatively matter that much for the Canadian oil industry in the short to the medium run, has, I think, increased the recognition that, the global situation is pretty volatile and that Canada needs to work faster and do more to get its oil to market in, and to different places around the globe, not just the United States. And so you have seen a lot of talk about, just since the Venezuela situation came about, that we need to be more serious and actually get some things accomplished, not just talk, in terms of, what the Prime Minister has said and promised to Alberta and to the oil industry. That, we actually do need to start making these investments right away. We need to be more urgent. And so I could see that increased urgency maybe increasing the likelihood that, there is some material progress in terms of actual boots on the ground, in terms of either building a pipeline to the West Coast, or there's talk about increasing, Canada's homegrown refining capacity as well. I could see this as, just doing a little bit more to put the pressure on, I think, the Carney government to actually take some action and not just, bandy nice words to Alberta and the oil industry.
Yeah, we could talk a good game, and President or Prime Minister Carney has been doing so, and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, they've signed, an agreement to push these kind of measures along. But at the end of the day, we need infrastructure built. We need to get these resources to market. Do you think what has happened in the U.S. and of course in Venezuela has kind of, triggered a new kind of view in terms of getting more oil, getting more energy out to other nations?
I mean, I think certainly what has happened in the U.S. with the tariffs over the last year has created a big resurgence in, I think, popular support across the country to do more to both, get more of our oil out of the ground, but also get it to a wider array of trade partners. I see that as being a much more important quantitatively source of support for this than the more recent events in Venezuela. The events in Venezuela, I think, are pushing this support even higher. But I see the situation with our new situation vis-a-vis the U.S. in terms of our trade relationship as being far and away the most important factor in driving that support.
I guess the biggest sticking point in terms of coast-to-coast access to product has always kind of been Quebec. They don't want to see a pipeline through their province, and they're always pushing back at, accepting that flow from Alberta across country. Do you see some movement there? And what is the economic impact of that eventually?
Well, so you did see Ontario Premier Doug Ford voice explicitly some, much stronger support for building pipelines across the country this week than I think he has perhaps said in the past. So that's, Ontario is right next door to Quebec, and maybe that's something. But I think the reality is that the far and away the most important factor here in terms of doing more to diversify our oil exports and is a pipeline to the West Coast and increasing our capacity to serve the Asian market in particular. Again, you mentioned China may well want to purchase more Canadian oil as a result of what's going on in Venezuela, but China is still a fast-growing economy. India is growing really fast as well. Southeast Asia in general is going to be a big source of economic growth globally. Getting more of our oil out of the West Coast into those markets, I think that's really where the action needs to be. Moving it to Quebec is important and would certainly help, I think, make our refined oil supply chain in Quebec a little bit safer and more diversified. It would help, drivers in Quebec rely less on oil that's refined in the United States. But in terms of the effect on the Canadian macroeconomy, getting to the West Coast is where it's at.
Is there another shoe to drop in this whole oil, gas, energy, we can even throw in LNG sector into this?
I think LNG is also, that is also a big question here. LNG is going to be, we have started already this year, this past year to export LNG to Asia. I see that as a big potential source of economic growth for Canada. That's something that I think we need to, double down on and, continue to make progress there. LNG demand in Asia, but also Europe, is only going to rise. I mean, all of the geopolitical situation with Russia, with Venezuela, with Iran, I mean, all of this, I think, just really sends the message home, or should send the message home to Canadians that, there are many people around the world that will be clamoring for a safer, more reliable source of energy, not just, crude oil, but also natural gas to heat homes and power, somewhat cleaner energy supplies. And so Canada really, I think, in the best case, does stand to gain a lot from that. But, as I think many people know, a lot of that is predicated on the extent to which we're willing to actually, make the policy changes needed at home to make those kinds of investments tenable.
Yeah, there seems to be, and there have been, a political roadblock when it comes to that. And when it comes to LNG, liquid natural gas, can Canada be a heavyweight on the global scene? And economically, how big of a boon could that be for our nation?
I think absolutely Canada could be a heavyweight there. We have one of the world's largest, some of the world's largest LNG reserves. But I think really, for me, the thing looking forward is that LNG is a great way to diversify against, potential changes in aggregate demand for crude oil. The world is in many places moving more towards, using electric vehicles. North America is increasingly kind of a standout in terms of not going forward with EV adoption. The emerging economies around the world are, I think, in many cases going right to driving EVs from not having cars at all. And so there is, I think people should be worried a little bit about, what's going to happen to crude oil prices 10, 15, 20 years down the line. But demand for LNG is not going to go away anytime soon. It's cleaner. It is, increasingly being used to displace coal and generating electricity because of that. And I think, as I mentioned, the part of the, one of the things that is related to what I mentioned earlier about geopolitical volatility is that, I can imagine that one of the reasons that LNG take-up hasn't been as high as it could be is precisely because many of the world's major LNG suppliers are so risky. And having Canada stand as a, really secure, safe, and reputable supply of LNG could, be an incredible economic boon for us. There could be, in the best case, a lot of demand for that.
Is it surprising that more nations are not knocking on our door to say, hey, we'd love your liquid natural gas?
I can see why you say that. But at the same time, I think we should ask ourselves why that might be. And I think that has to go to the, is the Canadian economy and the Canadian political system really prepared to action on those kinds of requests? And I think, many people would probably tell you that right now the answer is no.
From an economic standpoint, there has been a lot of talk about tariffs and the uncertainty it has caused. How is our economy handling all this, and how long can this go on for until we really start to notice some serious side effects?
Regarding the tariff situation more broadly, I think, many people seem to be unaware of the fact that Canada has far and away the best tariff deal with the United States. Our tariffs are pretty darn low, with the exception of certain sectors. And those sectors are steel, aluminum, and to a lesser extent, autos. But those tariffs are worldwide. They're not targeted specifically at Canada. Leaving those sectors aside, tariffs on Canada are, more or less zero. And so leaving those sectors aside, the Canadian economy is, actually kind of has largely shrugged the tariffs off. I think we're kind of in a steady state. I don't think we should expect to see continued downturn of the Canadian economy as a result of the tariffs, at least as a result of the tariffs that have been put in place so far. Who's to say, I know we're all here kind of, at least I am, waiting with bated breath to see what happens with, if there is a ruling on the tariffs today. But, going in either direction, you never know. The president could do something else. And certainly a wider swath of tariffs on the Canadian economy would be, pretty harmful.
Any update?
As long as we're in the situation we're in, I wouldn't expect to see the Canadian economy really turn more to the worse as a result of tariffs.
In terms of economic impact for the United States, is there any preliminary data through this first almost year in terms of, how tariffs have impacted companies and organizations in the U.S.? At
the firm and at the micro level, when we look at individual firms, individual products, there is, I think, lots of empirical evidence that products that are to which tariffs have been applied are becoming more expensive relative to products that have not been, and also manufactured products that heavily use tariffed intermediate inputs are becoming more expensive. There's no denying that. And I think, for many individual businesses, the tariffs are extremely harmful in the United States, small businesses specifically. It should be no surprise that all of the businesses that filed the lawsuits against the tariffs in the United States, they're all small businesses. But when you try to look at the aggregate data and tease out whether, and to what extent the U.S. economy as a whole, in terms of GDP growth and things like that, has been affected by tariffs, that is really hard to say. There's just an awful lot of other stuff going on. We've got the tariffs, we've got the huge corporate income tax changes as a result of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. We've got lots of turmoil related to adoption of AI and productivity growth that seems to that may or may not be coming as a result of that. I don't think that you can look at the aggregate data over the last year and make really draw any definitive conclusions about what the tariffs have done. I think we should also be mindful of the fact that most economists who look at this, and myself included, this is one of my areas of expertise, would tell you that tariffs are not going to have an immediate impact on the United States. The effect that they're going to have on the U.S. economy is going to be very gradual. It's going to, assuming these tariffs do remain in place for many years, which I think is a lot of uncertainty about that. But even if they did, it would take 5-10 years for the full effect of the tariffs to really be felt on the U.S. economy. I think we're just getting started as far as that goes.
And so, what kind of effects would those be?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think the best estimates are something like 0.5% to 1% of U.S. GDP. So you could think about that as being, as long as these tariffs are, remain in place, the potential impact on the U.S. economy is, about 0.5% to 1%. So the U.S. economy would be just a little bit smaller than it otherwise would have been. Jason Furman, an economist at Harvard, likened this to something like about $1,000 per person per year. So it's kind of a stupid policy. It makes things more expensive, reduces income. It's kind of like American consumers just kind of, lighting about, $1,000 per person per year on fire, and putting it in the trash. But it's not huge, but in the aggregate, it's not a small number either.
Yeah. I want you to look, and this is going to be a pure hypothetical, so you can go anywhere you want, but look into your crystal ball, and if these tariffs are still in effect at the end of the Trump presidency, which is 2028, if he does, in fact, decide not to, rip up the Constitution and run again, but then that's a whole different conversation, different podcast. Right. But if these tariffs are still in place by then, let's just say by even 2029, a change of government, and the next president says, you know what, we're going to tear all this apart, no more tariffs, what kind of economic mushroom cloud could we potentially see? So
if the tariffs are in place through 2028, 2029, and then they are all, eliminated, and the U.S. goes right back to where it was, in, say, 2019, 2020, in terms of tariffs, I think the first thing you'd see is a huge boom in the stock market in the U.S. That's undeniable. But again, I think you have to, to go back to the numbers that I was talking about a moment ago. In the aggregate, if we're talking about $1,000 per person per year that the tariffs have eliminated or lost, that's about, at the most, the U.S. economy has to gain from eliminating the tariff. So going either direction, you're not going to see a mushroom cloud in terms of the, changes in economic activity. You should expect to see big movements in asset prices. But I think that's about it. Certainly, it would be a boon to the Canadian economy. I think the biggest thing that we would gain from that is the elimination of the tariffs on steel, aluminum, and autos. But the reality is that I think we should be really cautious about tempering our expectations about what would happen. I think if the tariffs are still in place at the end of the Trump presidency, I think we should be, the odds that they're going to be fully eliminated by the next president, even if it is a Democrat, are lower than you might think. So I actually, one of my recent research projects was precisely on this issue relating to the tariffs that, were put in place in the first Trump presidency. And so if you looked at what firms were expecting about the likelihood that these tariffs would be eliminated, that was pretty high. That likelihood is pretty high towards the end of the first Trump presidency. But then President Biden decided not to eliminate the tariffs on those tariffs on China, which were the ones that had really been left in place at the end of the first Trump term. And so Biden didn't do anything with those. And in fact, those tariffs are still on the books today. And so that's, the precedent that we have, it is limited, but says that, I'm not sure that we should really expect to see even a Democrat completely rip up the new tariff system that President Trump has put in place.
Very interesting. We'll have to wait for that for sure. Professor Steinberg, really appreciate your time today. Thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers podcast.
Yeah, great to talk to you this morning.
All right, and thank you for checking out the Newsmakers podcast. A big thank you to the all-star cast behind the scenes as well. If you like today's episode, click the thumbs up, hit subscribe, leave a comment, catch the Newsmakers podcast on chch.com/podcasts and wherever you get your favorite podcasts.